Hello and welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this 20th Sunday after Pentecost, when our scripture reading is written in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Luke does love contrasts and reversals. Down and up, out and in. And here in this final story, in Luke's central section, his travel narrative that moves Jesus from Galilee to approaching Jerusalem, he has a story that epitomizes this love of contrast and reversal. The central section, by the way, began at chapter 9, verse 51, and it ends at the end of this reading, chapter 18, verse 14. And it has included a whole host of parables and teachings. The Lord's Prayer is in this section, a number of parables such as the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the parable of the prodigal. These are all part of this central section where Luke has drawn together quite a bit of the teaching material that is part of his tradition, looking back to Jesus' life and Jesus' message. And the theme of the exalted being humbled and the humbled being exalted, which is the very last verse of this whole long travel section, it comes up repeatedly. This verse, that whoever exalts himself will be humbled and whoever humbles himself will be exalted, is almost exactly duplicated back in chapter 14, verse 11. But even at the beginning of the travel section, when the disciples hear that someone is trying to claim to be part of Jesus' ministry when they really aren't, they say, should we call down fire from heaven on them? And Jesus rebukes them because they would exalt themselves over these others, and he rebukes them into a humble position. He says to the town of Capernaum in chapter 10, verse 15, do you exalt yourself to heaven? You will be brought down low. And in chapter 12, the parable of the rich fool who has barns and crops and a plenty and more coming in. He doesn't know where to put it all. So he says, I'll build bigger barns. I'll store up more. And then I'll say to my soul, you have plenty. Eat, drink, and be merry. Rest yourself. But tonight, God says, your soul is demanded of you. And then, fool, whose will all of this be? He was riding high, celebrating his exalted status, and the common denominator of death could bring him low in an instant. This is Luke's theme so often throughout his gospel and in this section. But after all, it goes all the way back to the very beginning of Luke's gospel, where Mary, when she is told by Gabriel that she will be the mother of this Son of David, Messiah, Christ, in her Magnificat talks about how despite her low estate, God has done great things for her, how the mighty will be cast down and the low will be exalted, lifted up, how the empty will be filled and the rich will be sent away empty. It's thematic right from the beginning of the gospel. And now here in this parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector in the temple, the contrast could not be stronger. But we have to be careful because it's not a contrast between all Pharisees and all tax collectors, as though one is good and the other is evil, or vice versa. Luke tells us in his own introductory verse that Jesus told this to those who were confident in themselves that they were righteous and looked at others as worthless. That's the contrast. How do you see yourself and others? And in order for that contrast to work, Jesus has to start, the parable has to start with the far extremes, the most radical differences that one can imagine. And so the Pharisee has to represent the one who is absolutely the most faithful, the paragon of Jewish observance. This has to be one who is most qualified to say, look, God, at what I do. And the tax collector has to be the one who is least regarded, least respected, least given a place anywhere within this religious community. The one who is least likely to be regarded by God as far as anybody around would say, because then the message becomes that not even a Pharisee whom you would expect to please God because of the faithfulness and the fullness of the religious practice, not even a Pharisee can rely on their own activity, on their own piety, on their own fasting, on their own tithing. Not even a Pharisee can rely on that. And at the other end of the spectrum, not even a tax collector, oh my gosh, not even a tax collector will fail to be reached by God. This one, if he relies on his own achievements, will be brought low. And this one, despite having no regard from anyone in the world, will be raised up. And the effect of that is whatever the moral scale of these two people, and honestly, Luke doesn't tell us. He doesn't say anything about whether the Pharisee is right in proclaiming this diligent practice according to the way that a Jew should live in that time. Is he lying about that? Luke doesn't tell us. Morally, he may be perfectly upright. And similarly, the tax collector. The tax collector may not be doing anything wrong in his life, and yet he knows that before God, he remains a sinner. Regardless of the moral scale, this parable teaches that all people share an equal dignity as children of God as those whom God creates and sustains and cherishes. It teaches not that tax collectors and outcasts are better people, or that Pharisees and rich people are worse people. It teaches that all of us, whatever our station in life, and whatever our moral claims might be, all of us live on God's strong grace and love. God bless.